first met Dr. Jehle at the New Hampshire Center for Constitutional Studies up in New Hampshire at one of their gatherings, where I was delighted to learn about this wonderful Christian man in Plymouth, Massachusetts, doing this great work. And it's every now and then I'll run into somebody in the Midwest or another part of the country, and they'll say, "You're from Boston. Do you know this guy down in Plymouth by the name of Jehle? I don't know how to spell it." And I had to figure it out. It took me a while before I figured how to spell it properly. And I said, yeah. He talked about the great work that he does down there. So, and sometimes his students will come to these functions. The last function they had in September, they had a young lady who was first generation Portuguese. I bought a car from her uncle when I first came on staff, so it was a good car too. And just so impressed by the caliber of young people coming out of this school. Anyway, let me read the online version of the introduction here. Dr. Paul Jehle is a senior pastor of the New Testament Church of Cedarville in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And by the way, maybe now and then I get a call from people relocating to the South Shore. Where can I find a good church? And I immediately give them the phone number of this church. Principal of the New Testament Christian School, founder of Heritage Institute Ministries, and education director for the Plymouth Rock Foundation. Dr. Jehle has traveled throughout the United States and in Canada, Latin America, and Africa, declaring biblical principles as they relate to church leadership and government, Christian education, youth ministry, and political statesmanship. He is the author of over 7 books, including the groundbreaking comprehensive book on Christian education by the title of Go Ye Therefore Teach All Nations, also published by the Plymouth Rock Foundation. The newest edition is ready to go, and I'll just leave it at that. But let's give a very warm hand. And by the way, his talk is going to be America's Christian Heritage. Let's give a very nice hand.
Well, it's good to be here, and good to be with you up here in Wakefield. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I was converted to Christ by my basketball coach in college, and my father was a congregational pastor for many years, and raised us. I was a PK. We grew up in the church, and then he began to recognize that it wasn't simply in the formality of Christianity where there was true life. So when he got converted, it kind of shook things up in our family and everywhere else. And then I followed suit. I wasn't the only one. My brother is 2 years younger, my sister 2 years older, and my mother all eventually became Christians. But the interesting thing about that was I find a lot of individuals who become Christians and don't go very far in their discipleship into Christianity and all of its breadth. And one of the things I began to do was I was an avid reader as a child, and I began to read every place I could about how Christianity had influenced the culture. I just had this disdain for individuals who wanted to become Christians so that Christ could come back as soon as possible and get them out of here. I was concerned that we somehow make a mark while we're here. And as I began to study this, I came into contact in 1978. I came into contact with a gentleman by the name of Russ Walton, who was the executive director for the Plymouth Rock Foundation. He lived in New Hampshire, in Marlborough, New Hampshire. And he introduced me to someone that was in my own backyard, who I had met on a couple of occasions by the name of John Talcott. And John Talcott was an individual who's still alive today. He's 99. At that time, he had been the director for the 350th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims in Plymouth in 1970. Well, Plymouth was where I was living, close to Plymouth. I met him, went to his estate, and he took me to his library. And there in this library, he opened it up, and he basically said, look, you can come here anytime you want and study from these books. And then he began to take them down from the shelves. They were all primary source documents on America's history. In fact, they were books that the founders read before they drafted the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and they were books from the 1600s and the 1500s where individuals, pilgrims, and Puritans. And so I was going to read from the source of where they got it, and of course he kept reminding me, of course, they all got it from Christianity and from the Bible. Now I was the kind of an individual that loved to go back to the source. I hate to drink stale water. I like to get it right from the well. I like to get it right out from the source, so I began to study that. And in 1978, I started my research. I started my research on various fronts to find out the origin. Where did we get a republic from? And I began to trace that back and found out that we got a republic from the Republican nature of Old Testament government in the nation of Israel. I thought, wow, that's amazing, because most people who research the history of anything only stop halfway or it's quarter measures. I would read a book, and Russ Walton would be my mentor, and I would read a book and say, but Russ, the textbook in high school says that the American government was patterned after Rome and Greece. And he would always say these words, my dear Paul, they have it all wrong. And then he would give me the statistics and give me the sources, and then give me a teaser, a couple of books that I hadn't had. I got to be such a glutton 10 years later. In 1988, anybody who said, have you read this book, and I hadn't, I certainly would have it within 10 to 12 days. And be digesting it on every plane trip and everywhere else. And I began to recognize that there were several things that began to dawn on me that I hadn't known before. And that I dare say my generation is inheriting a complete void of this. And really, we need to pray for the next generation that's coming, which is far more deprived than my generation was. And when you look at the generation of my father, and the World War II generation, and those who were willing to lay down everything in patriotism for this nation and their honor of this nation, we have a terrible vacuum in the nation today when individuals do not understand why they're going to be patriotic. Patriotism is only as veiled and as surface as it may be simply to stir the emotions with the American flag without understanding what it actually stands for. So when I began to do this, I began to see this. As the Bible says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord in Psalm 33, and the people whom he hath chosen for his own inheritance. This began to come up on understand this, that I asked questions like this. Well, how does a nation crown God as Lord and the God of the Bible and Christianity? How does a nation do that? How does a nation get blessed? Well, the Bible verse gives a great hint about that. When the people that God has chosen for his own inheritance, his people, truly crown him Lord, it is going to influence a nation to be blessed. Or, this is what Russ Walton would say to me so often. Paul, you've got to understand, it's the condition of God's people that will eventually determine the condition of the culture. Not out of pride, but out of humility, out of influence. Thus, the darkness we see in the culture, the amnesia that grips our nation, and in fact the illiteracy, not just functional illiteracy, to which Sam Blumenfeld could speak at any moment, drop of a hat, but to actual historical illiteracy, constitutional illiteracy, law illiteracy. All those areas come from an amnesia, from not understanding their source. And you see, if the Christian who should understand it will do nothing with it, if the individual who should honor the source of it will do nothing with it, we're going to have a major collapse in the culture by default. And because of this, it's not that the Christian should rule like a tyrant. I'm constantly on talk shows, radio shows, television shows, and the debate will certainly rise. And I'm one to throw a small grenade and let it explode, and then take some of the opposition. I said, well, gee, I remember someone who said to me on the radio, was debating a New Ager out of Phoenix, and this individual said, well, Jehle, if people like you ran this nation, we'd be under tyranny. And I said, well, that's very interesting, because actually the Christian faith that I have is what motivates me to oppose tyranny. I actually believe the following. And I said back to the man on the radio, I said, look, I actually believe if you actually followed your own philosophy, you would initiate tyranny. Now it got really dicey, because he was saying, well, you're just a fundamental right-wing religious fanatic, and you're going to bring us under the law of God. And I said, well, that wouldn't be such a bad thing after all. I said, the law of God has only 10 commandments, whereas the Federal Register couldn't be read in an entire lifetime. Well, it was time for a commercial break, and it's time to go on that, because the issue is, it's actually the absence of God's law that has brought us into tyranny, not the presence of it. And this has caused a lot of people great confusion. It reminds me, once I began to uncover not just the biblical roots and the Christian roots of American law, why we got what we got from Christianity. And there are a lot of people who love the fruit of Christianity while they deny the root of it. And they don't want to talk about where it comes from, but they sure love the fruit of that. As I reminded my dear debating friend when we were on the radio, he just basically said, I just can't stand you guys and what you're going to produce. I said, well, actually, actually, I don't really believe you believe that statement. I said, why don't you live in a nation that takes your religious presuppositions as the basis of its law? Why don't you live under the shade of the tree of your religion? I got really quiet. And I said, shall I suggest what nation that might be? And then it was, no. How come you live in America? Well, I live in America because there's no freedom in that nation. I said, I wonder why there's no freedom in that nation. And therefore, I said this, I said, as long as everybody who's listening to this radio program understands that you appreciate the shade of the tree I espouse so that you have the freedom to vilify me. And of course, that was time for another break. But you know, you recognize that when you're dealing with this concept, it is not a matter of Christians ruling, it's Christians influencing. We are to serve. And yet knowledge can be very, very helpful in that. I can remember a time I began after I studied with Russ Walton, a certain course that he took me through called Fundamentals for American Christians. We still sell that as part of the Plymouth Rock Foundation because it's so systematic in touching the origin of the United States of America and its form of government. It's a very systematic course used in Sunday schools, used in all kinds of, has very, very neat lessons that you can do. I've taught that several times. We have now supplemental readings and that's all on CD and whatnot that people can use. And I remember going through that course. And then I taught it to our students, and then I began writing courses because, after all, I ran an academy, and I wanted an academy that was not following just textbook publishers. So we created our own, and we wrote our own history classes. And I wrote a 9th grade constitutional law course. We studied the Constitution the entire year. We start with the Old Testament, the Bible. We find the origin of law, and we go line by line through the Constitution. And I ended with 6 weeks on the state Constitution of Massachusetts because I found no one was teaching it, and most legislators I had met had never read it. So I look at it and I'd say, when we went through those, and then I wrote an American Foreign Policy course and Universal History course, and we have some of those things now available. Homeschoolers use them and whatnot. Well, I'm teaching with students, and I can remember, and I decided, let's do something very fun. Let's have a candidate forum. We'll run the candidate forum, ask the candidates to come into the church, and we'll run the candidate forum, and we'll be totally equal. I'm not giving any greater time to anybody I might agree with more than anyone else. And we had them all. We had because of course the third-party candidates showed up in force because it's the only time they had equal time. And so they began to come and they really loved it. And they were all over the map politically, and that was fine with me. But what I did was I trained the students, and they would come before the students, and it would invariably turn into a debate. These are 8th grade, 9th grade, and 10th grade students. The nice part about it is they took to this like a duck takes to water. The bad part about it, they have absolutely no tact, and when they smell blood, they go like sharks. And I'm telling you, I can remember a guy who came in one day, and I tell him, you get on the phone with these guys, you can debate them, but you're going to be their host when they come to the candidate forum. I came back from a speaking engagement, walked into the building, and the secretary said, Dr. Jehle, you got to get to your office in a hurry. There's a man in there that won't leave. I said, a man that won't leave? Is this a terrorist situation? Or what are we dealing with here? No, this man will not leave. He's got buttons all over him. He must be running for office. Then I thought, oh no, which 8th grader has I went to my office, and here's this man pacing back and forth, going back and forth, and he's upset. I walk in, I said, hi, how are you doing? And he said, look, I would not leave here till I spoke to you. Your 8th grade girl got me on the phone last night. I said, oh, she did? I said, who was it? I just want to make sure. And he told me, and I said, oh, good. Knowing she was feisty, man. She's a bulldog. I mean, you're going to be in trouble. And he said, she came to me and she started asking me questions no one has asked me on the entire campaign. I said, like what? She started out, where do rights come from? Man, he said, he said, I told her, I can't tell you, I'm going to call you back after I go back to the textbooks that I studied in college. So then I called her back. He said about 9 o'clock at night, I called her back. I apologized to her parents, but I said I was going to give her an answer. And I said, all right, I've looked at it. I've understood my political science course. And the federal constitution grants rights to the states, and the state constitutions protect them. There you go. There's your answer. So her response to me was, so you don't believe in the Declaration of Independence? And I was aghast. I said, well, what do you mean? Well, it says we're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Why are you getting yours from a piece of paper? He said, I was so upset. He said, I began to think, well, how could I answer her? And then he looked at me in the office and said, this is an 8th grader! And I began to recognize the power of arming people. We've had candidates who come to the classroom, and one of them was against the death penalty, and so he was really arguing. He actually personally took a different position, but he was doing this, and the students were debating with him to the place where he finally was walking out of the classroom backwards and simply said, you know what, if I was a murderer, I would not want you for a jury. One of the ninth graders said, you got our point. But you see, we don't need a new generation simply that wants to dive into people, but we do need to arm people with the truth. And then we need to give them the grace to know how to portray it, how to say it, how to describe it. This is not a holy war in the sense of Christians have to rule rather than other people have to rule or put people under your thumb. The beauty of Christianity is that when you come to serve, and you serve with an attitude of true service, the influence takes care of itself. And therefore, this is not a holy call to arms in the sense of overtaking a culture. This is learning to serve a culture. And I thought of this, in keeping with the Christmas season, and that movie that's going to be shown 1,000 times before Christmas, It's a Wonderful Life, I thought of this concept. It's not just to pose the question, did Christianity have anything to do with the founding of America? We might repose or rephrase that question. What if Christianity was not a part of the founding of America? What would be different? What would the historian be able to see? And I just offer a few suggestions here this morning. That if Christianity, if the religion of Jesus Christ, if the New Testament and the Old Testament of the Bible had never been a part of the founding of this nation, or had such a minor role that it never really became the basis of the common law, never really became the basis of the United States of America, then truly, what would be different? Well, first of all, I thought, interestingly enough, we probably would all be speaking Spanish. Now, I'm not against Spanish, and I've been in many Spanish countries and have a high regard for the Spanish culture and for Central and South America, but I mean it this way. We would probably have been under the Spanish Empire in 1588. You may remember that the Spanish Armada, which was brought forward for one specific purpose, with 30,000 men, 130 ships, to destroy the Reformation in England, having a log on board the ships of all the key reformers, many of whom became the Pilgrim leaders that came to America, to destroy that fledgling Reformation which was keeping England out from under the thumb of the Pope at the time. That indeed, if there had been no influence of Christianity, that Spanish Armada would have been successful, because it was indeed those little tiny English ships bobbing across the ocean that the big, heavy Spanish tanks, who only had about 6 inches above the water line because of their weight, that would have blown out of the air. Yeah, and yet, what was that called? Do you know, when that storm came and blew the Armada all the way up to Norway and around England, they called it the Protestant wind. In fact, it was Elizabeth herself who coined a major coin in the nation. God blew, and they were scattered. In fact, it was credited to prayer, credited to the formation of the Reformation. If that had been removed, there would have been nothing stopping the conquering of England. And the whole Western Hemisphere would be different than it is today. There would have been no continued cry like there was of sola scriptura, or sola Christe, sola fide, sola gratia, sola dea gloria. None of those major phrases out of the Reformation would have come from England, particularly, which specifically affected Western civilization, and specifically the United States, what would become the United States of America. Second, there would have been no Jamestown and no Christian common law. Now, it has been a very, very nice thing to do this year, politically correct, 400th anniversary of Jamestown, to bash Jamestown and everything to do with it. So some people say, no, Jamestown, that would be wonderful. Well, the interesting thing is, with Jamestown and the founding of Jamestown came the common law, built on Christianity, and came the Geneva Bible. It's interesting to note that when that came, it was Christianity from Richard Hakluyt that inspired Western civilization to begin with. England was not even going to be involved in exploring America or this coast, because England was too afraid of the Spanish and the French, who were so involved. French up north, Spanish down south, and you had this tract of land in between. Now, it was Sir Walter Raleigh and others that said to Elizabeth and to King James, you better settle quickly, because if you don't get that middle ground, nobody's going to be there and you're going to lose it forever. And of course, who were the ones that influenced Elizabeth and King James? They were the Christians like Richard Hakluyt and Sir Edwin Sandys in the Parliament in England, who influenced them. Now, if there had been no Christianity, if there had been no Bible, there would have been no Sir Edwin Sandys to influence King James to actually sign a charter in 1606. There was a Christian charter, and what was written in the charter, he disagreed with. So here's a king who actually puts his seal to a charter he doesn't agree with. How does that happen? Political expediency. Why? Because the individuals influencing him were so influential in the empire. What is it that King James opposed? Well, whether he read the whole thing or not, one key statement in there which came directly from Christianity was this, that when individuals settled in a new land, their rights would go with them. See, if you were from Spain, the rights remained in the crown. The rights remained in the homeland, and you were merely a subject of somebody else under tyranny because you had government-granted privileges, not unalienable rights. The concept of a right that can never leave you because it's given to you by God, and if God gives rights, then government can't take them away, that was a concept unique to England. And it was a concept unique to Christianity. No other religion came up with an unalienable rights philosophy and concept. Why other religions, you do not get your rights directly from God, as if you're independent from God, and because of that, other religious philosophies produce different forms of government. They produce different philosophies of rights. And yet here in England, in a charter of 1606, which we celebrated the quadricentennial of that last year, is an unalienable rights clause in paragraph 15 of that charter of 1606. That wouldn't have been there if there had been no Christianity. If there had been no Bible, there would have been no seminal understanding of unalienable or inalienable rights, unable to be alienated from you, unalienable to be ever separated from you, because they were given to you by God, not by government. That was an interesting concept coming from Christianity alone. In fact, it was John C. Wu in 1955 in his book, The Economy into the Anglo-American Legal System, and he said these words. He said, while the Roman law was a deathbed convert to Christianity, the common law was a cradle Christian. Now, what does he mean? He means that Christianity directly formed the common law. If you study it historically, the Galatian believers written to by the book of Galatians in the New Testament went into the British Isles. They went into the British Isles and eventually within 50 to 60 years began the conversion process of the Celts. That's the ancient Celts that gave us the Druids and Halloween. When they went there and then converted them, in a matter of 50 to 60 years, the Celts had become Christians by about 100 to 150 AD, by the legacy of those who brought the proper understanding of grace and law or liberty. The result of that was to write a book for the entire culture in the British Isles called the Liber Ex Lege Moisi. In Latin, Liberty from the Law of Moses, or of the Ten Commandments. That became the basis of law that St. Patrick found when he went into England in the 300s and 400s. And when he found it, he republished that book, the Liber Ex Lege Moisi. That became the basis of law that King Alfred used in 890 AD to write his code of laws. The legacy was clear. From the Old and New Testaments, the Ten Commandments and the Beatitudes, which King Alfred had made sure that was clear in his book, became the basis of what we then began to know as the common law. Why the common law? Not the common denominator of what people think law is. No, the common law is what is common to everyone. What is common to every man, regardless of station, background, or ethnic, or any other difference, that common law was traced from the Ten Commandments. Now, why is that so significant? Some would say the Ten Commandments, heaven help us, that's tyranny itself. Well, people don't look at the Ten Commandments. It's kind of interesting when someone said, well, we shouldn't have the Ten Commandments engraved anywhere. I also ask them, name one. Interestingly, if they begin to do that, I'll say, don't you notice something about the commandments? All of them except one are in the negative. Thou shalt not, thou shalt not, thou shalt not. Now, honor your father and mother is very positive, and when you talk about honoring the Sabbath day, it's still done in the context of a negativity. And I said to them, why do you suppose that's the case? Because you see, God wrote his laws in the negative because it would keep civil government limited. Because the only power government has is what's expressly given to it. That's why it's structured that way. God's law is structured in such a way that it produces in the human form of civil government only express power documents. It doesn't improve, it doesn't create implied power documents. It doesn't create things that are in the mind of the ruler that he just makes up out of thin air. Not at all. You see, that civil law began that. Why was King Alfred the only king of England ever called great? Because he actually promised no more to do for the people than the expressed power of the law he was under. Now that would make a very interesting change to most presidential debates. Because most presidential debates are 90% promising what are unconstitutional, they have no power to do anyway, and the whole topic should be removed from the table. And yet, here's King Alfred, who's a king, and yet he's voluntarily being limited in his power by an express power understanding of law itself. And that's his code of laws. This is the heritage of England. This is the heritage Christianity gave to England, and it's the heritage that did come here. In fact, as Bracton himself said, the king himself ought not to be under man but under God, and under the law, because the law makes the king. There is no king where will and not law wields dominion. That, as a vicar, God, he ought to be under the law, is clearly shown by the example of Jesus Christ. For although he lay open to God for the salvation of the human race, many ways and means, he used not the force of his power, but the counsel of his justice. Why? He was willing to go under the law that he might redeem those that were under the law. He was unwilling to use power, but instead justice and judgment. Now here is an excellent statement from the 13th century on the legacy of true law. That Jesus Christ himself came under the law, not outside the law, not using his force, not calling an army at Gethsemane to take care of the Roman soldiers, but actually coming under law to redeem those that were going to live under law. Christianity was intertwined with the inheritance we had of the common law. Third, there would have been no pilgrims, no Plymouth Colony, no Mayflower Compact. Some would say that's fine. They're not in any textbooks anyway. Well, the point is, if there was no pilgrims, there'd be no Scrooby Covenant of 1606, where they covenanted to themselves as a church government, and then patterned it for the Mayflower Compact in 1620 on board the Mayflower. Now, what's so interesting about that? Well, the phrase starts, "In the name of God, amen, we whose names are underwritten, the subjects of our sovereign Lord King James." Now, this is kind of interesting. They said dreaded King James. Yeah. But the point is, when they had that Mayflower Compact, you know how unique that is on board the cabin of the Mayflower? God, human beings, government. In England, it had become God to the king to you. In the Mayflower Compact, it was God to you and then out to the king. Or in other words, God gave rights directly to the individual and government was delegated from the individual. That's an interesting concept. That's a unique concept. The Declaration of Independence would shadow this. In fact, the Declaration of Independence is a child of the Mayflower Compact. Just like the Constitution written by the Pilgrims in 1636, its child could be traced to the United States Constitution. Inseparably linked, inseparably wed, and impossible to be separated and still keep the ideas intact. The two are like two sides of a coin. That concept would not exist. Without Christianity, without the Bible, in American history, the notion of self-government, the notion of you can govern yourself internally and you need less civil laws externally. The more internal government you have, the less external government you need. That's a Christian concept. It doesn't come from other places. You don't draw that out of other kinds of religions. It is unique to Christianity because Christianity controls a person from the inside out, not the outside in. Therefore, Christianity does not need the force of external law as much as the force of internal influence. What a difference for the individual. Why liberty comes rather than slavery. Slavery comes from other notions that are antithesis to Christianity and the Bible. And yet what we've been taught today is to fear Christianity and fear the Bible as to the bringing of tyranny. Now, sometimes that's true by ignorant Christians who wear the name of Christianity and act just like every other tyrant, be it socialistic or in any other way. Certainly it may give it a bad name, but every religion suffers from those who give it a bad name. We can't simply shrink from that. We need to propagate what the truth is and recognize it. So, what if you'd never been born? What if Christianity had never influenced this nation? We would be in absence of the common law. that's written into our Constitution. We'd be in absence of self-governing compacts and covenants. Fourth, we'd have no great awakening. There would have been no repentance for the Salem witch trials. There would have been no George Whitefield preaching throughout the colonies. Now, what difference would that have made? It was the Great Awakening that directly affected the American Revolution. In fact, the average colonial churchgoer heard 7,000 sermons in their lifetime, 15,000 hours of note-taking in your lifetime just by going to church. Now that influenced the landscape phenomenally. It was actually said by the Yale professor Stout in his great book called The New England Soul. He made this statement. He said that if a young person between the ages of, in their teen years, from the time they were 10 or 11 years old to the time they're 18, just simply went to church. Remember, you got a 2-hour sermon in the morning, you had another 2 hours, one in the afternoon, then the Thursday current event lecture, usually done Thursday on the town green. If you just went to church and took notes, it would be equivalent to 3 college educations today just by going to church in colonial America. And it's amazing because today sometimes preachers, you can't find much that they say in 20 minutes for sure, and if it's an hour, it's torture. Back then, for 2 hours, you could take one text and make 15 applications. And if you couldn't do that in 2 hours, you weren't worth your salt, which is the origin of the word salary. You wouldn't get paid. Today, people get fired for preaching for 2 hours. You won't like it when that happens. But you recognize there would have been no basis for this, no basis of covenant and Reformed theology. And the fact that government goes from the bottom up and the inside out came out of the pulpits. That's why England, when they sent their troops, desecrated the pulpits, whether it's the Old South Church in Boston or others. They hated what came from the pulpits. The English knew what we don't know today, and that the liberty of America came from these pulpits. That's why historians said John Calvin was the author and the founder of American liberty. Why? Because it came out of the religious ideas. There's no Christian heritage in America. There would have been no America. There would have been no basis. Atheism doesn't produce a limited constitution. Neither does any religion that falsifies the nature of man. Because if man is born good, then government can be unlimited. You can change people from the outside in. But if man is born a sinner, then you have to have those sinners held down, as Jefferson said, by the chains of the Constitution. Because there's no possible way to completely trust those who have power. Not only that, there would have been no American Revolution, no Declaration of Independence. What was the cry of the Revolution? No king but King Jesus. The Scotch-Irish Presbyterians came into the colonies in the 1700s. They produced those preachers. And it was the preachers who led their congregations, sometimes dramatically, out on the lawn after church, under the beat of drum, taking off their vestral robes and revealing their patriotic uniforms underneath. It was the preachers, you see, like Jonas Clark, who stood along the road at Lexington Green, where the head of his deacon board, Jonas Clark, who was there, who was the captain of the militia. That's why all the ammunition was stored in the basement of the church. That was part of the deacon's responsibility. That's a shock. But it was his deacon board, it was his leaders that were on that green facing those British redcoats. The ideas within the Declaration of Independence came directly from Christianity. They didn't come from the Renaissance. Yes, later on they were affected by the Renaissance and European ideas, but initially they came forth. Read Gary Amos's great book, Defending the Declaration, for the origin of those ideas. There's plenty of material out to be able to show you. And we could go on and on and on. But it's not some minor relationship between Christianity and the founding of America. In fact, we could go in and say, well, there's been no Constitution, no Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights is the Bill of Wrongs from the states telling the Congress what it can't do, whereas the Constitution is an express powers document telling the government the only thing that it can do. And that was the big debate over the Bill of Rights. There would have been no debate over any kind of text of the Constitution if it was this living and breathing document. It was the people who were living and breathing. This has already been noted. And the fact of the matter is that when you did that idea of interpreting the Constitution from its original intent is a biblical and a theological idea. That's the only way the Bible gets properly interpreted. The reason we have such what we may call, really not using the word liberal in its proper sense, but the idea we have such laissez-faire and no convictions in the church today is because the Bible is treated like people treat the Constitution. They treat the Bible as if there's no reason to interpret it by its original intent. It means whatever you want it to mean at whatever time you want it to mean, because the idea is within the beauty of the interpreter. Now that's what we call heresy in theological school. But you see, that concept of original intent did not come out of thin air. Did not come from James Madison. James Madison will tell you. Read the book on how he was educated, where he actually came from. What kind of curriculum did we set before James Madison? That's what I wanted a private academy to do. I wanted to start setting the same thing. Teach them Latin again. Teach them the Greek origins of the words. Help them to understand what the primary source documents are about liberty, and put a truly classical education in front of young people and watch them go for it. There would have been no Bill of Rights, no Constitution. There would have been no volunteerism in this nation. Volunteerism built this nation. Where does the idea of volunteerism come from that solved immigration? It's built orphanages, hospitals, privately funded educational and welfare-driven programs to help the poor. Why were they not publicly funded? Why were they not state-run? Because in Christianity, the concept is you reform without tarrying for any. You get it done before somebody else does it wrong. It's a race to the righteous. It's a contest for the virtuous. If something is wrong in the community, don't wait for somebody to have some state agency do it. Not because the state is evil. The state is ordained by God to protect. But it's better done by private individuals who love. My mentor used to say, states can't love by their very nature, but people are commanded to. Big difference between the two. There's a positive reason it should be done by the private sector. Not just a negative reason against the other. In fact, it gets more convicting at a time of Christmas when we look around us, and Christians ought to remember the heritage of their own faith so strongly that it's very difficult today to get people inspired to be able to do these things, because today people are more inclined to complain about what's wrong than volunteer to do something to make it right. It's part of the human nature. We decry this all the time. I spent 7 years studying every conspiracy book I could find. It depressed me. I needed the information. I try to stay up on it. But I'll tell you this, it's more important for you and I to do that which is right and lend a helping hand through volunteerism than really to complain about what is wrong. And it's 10 times more powerful. And you'll be heard by more people based on what you do rather than what you don't like and wish wasn't done. In fact, you recognize this. There would have been no Monroe Doctrine in foreign policy either, since that came from Christianity as well. No Central and South American independence that was inspired by the Constitution. Monroe's idea was built on the law of nations and written into our Constitution. What on earth is that? The law of nations came from the Golden Rule, Matthew 7:12. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't do unto others as they have done unto you, but do unto others as you would want done to you. That was the Golden Rule. That was reasoned out of the Reformation. Hugo Grotius, Puffendorf, Vattel, they all reasoned from biblical principles to give us a foreign policy that let people alone in peace, stop meddling in their affairs, and only interpose when it's righteous and proper for you to do so. There would have been no abolition of slavery had there been no Christianity in this country. The abolitionists, by and large, were Christians who preached it from their pulpits. There would have been no interest in constitutional government as we know it in America. Thus, if we could conclude, if we could look at this, we'd say the following. Also, we wouldn't even have an opportunity today to inform people's amnesia with truth if we had never been founded properly in the first place. Because you see, if there had been no Christianity and no Bible, then we would be in an always upending struggle to retain liberty, but with our feet on sand. What we have is an opportunity, in spite of the culture, in spite of the ignorance. We have an opportunity to spark a love of liberty that is embedded in this culture, bringing someone back from amnesia to actual literate understanding and heritage. We have that opportunity because Christianity did influence this nation. And in such a way. Now, was it perfect? Of course not. Did Christians make mistakes? They do every day. There was no nation that has a perfect history. But I wouldn't trade one that's built on the kind of ideas that produced the kind of liberty and productivity that this nation understood and experienced. I wouldn't trade that for other nations and other religions. And not because I down anyone that wants to believe whatever they want, but I will ask them this. Always look to what that religion produces in the end. What kind of shade does it give other people? How generous is it? How tolerant is it in the true meaning of toleration and not necessarily the twisted, equivocated, illogical meanings today? But instead, where would we be? Ponder that thought and recognize maybe it's Christianity we've misunderstood rather than misunderstanding simply people's political motives. Maybe it's the source, and if we return to the source, maybe we'll also return to the fruit. May God bless you. Merry Christmas.